Feel free to share where you're from and your name in the chat. It's always great to see how many people from around the world join us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. Welcome. I'm Dr. Anthony Chow, Director of the SJSU School of Information. Thank you for joining us for celebration of Disability Pride Month. Today's theme is moral treatment, libraries, neurodiversity, and labor in historical context. This invites us to look honestly at the past and together design a more accessible future. We'll begin with a keynote by Dr. Ben Mitchell and continue with the discussion featuring Dr. Christine Moeller in a panel discussion. Live captioning is enabled, and if you don't see it, please turn on your Zoom's closed captioning option. Disability Pride is about rights, culture, and community, about naming barriers and removing them. Libraries are often the first and sometimes the only civic spaces people can access without cost. We were just talking about cost before we began today. That's an extraordinary responsibility. As we explore the history embedded in moral treatment, we'll ask what legacies we want to leave behind. Not gatekeeping or good intentions alone, but universal design, inclusive hiring and mentoring, and systems that work for everyone, including our disabled colleagues and patrons. I want to recognize the many students, alumni, faculty, and staff, and community partners joining us today. Your presence signals that accessibility is not a side project. It's core to librarianship and to the information professions. When we build sensory-friendly spaces, write in plain language, budget for assistive technologies, describe materials with accessibility metadata, and make virtual programs fully inclusive, we're not checking boxes, we're raising the quality of service for all. And I will be the first one to tell you that we have a lot of work to do at the School of Information, especially our virtual reality spaces. A quick roadmap for today. We'll keep the chat respectful and on topic, and we'll model inclusive communication. Please share your name if you wish, your pronouns when you comment. We'll collect questions for speakers in the Q&A. Feel free to ask them in the chat as well. And after the keynote, we'll transition to a panel discussion and then close with key takeaways and steps. As educators and information professionals, our charge is simple and ambitious: make it possible for everyone to learn, create, and belong. That's policy and procurement, yes, but it's also culture. It's the way we design courses, staff our service points, write our signage, moderate our online communities, and measure success. If what we build isn't reachable, it isn't done. That's why I like usability. Thank you again for choosing to spend your time here and for the work you'll take back to your institutions. On behalf of the School of Information, I'm grateful to our speakers and to all of you for your leadership. With that, it's my honor to introduce you to our keynote, Dr. Ben Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is a librarian, educator, and researcher with a background in the history of science, medical humanities, and neurodiversity studies. He's committed to making scholarship more accessible as an assistant curator at the Lakeshore Grounds Interpretive Centre. They help design public programming related to the history of mental health and neurodivergence at the site of the former Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital in Etobicoke, Ontario. I don't apologize in advance for mispronouncing that. They are an international speaker on topics related to neurodiversity and librarianship, and help to organize the NeuroglamOris Discord server and yearly Neuroglam conference for neurodivergent gallery, library, archives, and museum workers. So without further ado, I'll drop his handles, social media handles in the chat. But I would like to welcome Dr. Ben Mitchell as our keynote. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm just going to share my talk now. Boop. I should see it. There we go. So I won't be able to see comments, but at the end I will. So yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. Today, as mentioned, we'll be talking about moral treatment, libraries, neurodiversity, and labor in historical context. But before that, a little bit more of a positioning statement. This is a very traditional Canada. This work was done on the lands of the Kalal within Uluk, the traditional and unceded territory of the Squam, specifically in Squilton or Williams Lake, British Columbia. Every time I do a land acknowledgement, I put a loonie aside here for the Orange Shirts Foundation, which was to support survivors of the residential schools. I started doing this practice about 2 years ago and have raised about $180 now, just through that alone. I know it's not a lot in the cosmic scheme of things, but if everyone who said they cared about decolonization actually did that, it could represent a more substantial transfer of resources for reparations. A little bit more positioning, again, he, they. I'm Nova Scotian British settler from rural Mi'kma'ki, or Nova Scotia. In terms of my own settler legacies, my family's the reason why there are no more oysters in Oyster Pond, Nova Scotia. Also, my mother wasn't just a babysitter, she was a British nanny. She could come over as being a relatively low-class Scouser from Liverpool and still have certain kind of privileges in Canada because of those colonial legacies. Also, I'm related to this person, Verdun Mitchell, who apparently is, according to the Halifax Examiner, the rot at the core of Halifax's police and justice system. We all have either settler or Indigenous legacies to engage with here in Turtle Island or North America, and I feel like it's important that both sides of the equation actually explore their histories and talk about those histories. In terms of neurodivergence and disability, also positioning myself, I'm AU ADHD, autistic and ADHD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Sadly, oftentimes these things go together. Possibly bipolar. I've only had one manic episode. It was actually during the final semester of my library school master's, which was unfortunate. Likely several unidentified learning disabilities, such as dysgraphia, and importantly, the neurodivergent child of neurodivergent parents. Not every neurodivergent person has that particular experience, and it plays out differently depending on how you relate to your larger family structure. A bit of an outline because I need to be controlled a little bit. First part, we'll be kind of talking about some theoretical topics regarding the relationship between libraries, neurodivergence, and labor. Then we'll be talking about moral treatment as a specific kind of medical modality that was popular in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, how deinstitutionalization as a process unfolded in Ontario, which is the case study I know the best, the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital. And you might ask, well, why would you want to focus on this when primarily we're librarians? Well, I would argue that deinstitutionalization in the 70s and 80s kind of reflects a certain kind of model of the logics in which public institutions, such as libraries, are systematically dismantled. So kind of, I think there's helpful analogies to be drawn there about the logics, rhetorics, and practices that destroy public institutions, even if in the case I'd like to think that libraries are generally less ambivalent and ambiguously good than psychiatric hospitals were because they had very fraught histories. Then we'll talk about gaslighting, which I see just now that I spelled incorrectly, and how accommodations are themselves can be barriers. So that might be seen counterintuitive. Hopefully by the end, you'll see what I mean by that. We'll talk about autism, expertise, and the job hunt, and just kind of wrap it up by kind of reflecting on the ways in which labor protections are themselves neurodivergent protections, but they're necessary but not sufficient. Also, content. I know there's a lot of preamble here. Thank you for staying with me. I find a hard time talking about our world today without talking about a lot of upsetting things. We'll be talking about ableism, eugenics, forced labor, Nazis, suicide, medically assisted death, and death by fire. If any of these topics particularly upset you, understandable. Look after yourself first. Nothing that I say now is irreplaceable. And if you need to step out, you can step out. So really, where do libraries and neurodiversity kind of intersect? Well, there's a lot of different ways, right? Historically, I mean, there's been the book madness and bibliomaniac kind of movements in the 18th and 19th centuries, the way in which kind of like books and libraries and literacy were associated with a certain degree of eccentricity, oftentimes kind of like wealthy, air quotes, eccentric people who were known for hoarding books in a very particular way. And a lot of early libraries and the book trade were connected to these kind of aristocratic kind of bibliomaniacs, right? But also the book trade wasn't just a lot of passionate neurodivergent people in the 18th and 19th century. There was also a lot of commodity speculation and tax evasion going on in the rare books trade at that time. And even today, there's a lot of tax evasion in the rare books trade today. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but it's a phenomenon. Also, in terms of what was known as the moral edification of patients in the asylums, which we'll talk more about when we talk about early precursors to bibliotherapy, as well as the tools of medical staff. A lot of asylums had two different kinds of libraries on site. They had libraries specifically for the patients that were structured in a very particular way, which we'll talk about, and they had libraries for the medical staff. And importantly, for much of that history, they didn't want those collections to intersect, and to keep those things separated, which we'll talk about. Also, modern bibliotherapy. For those of you who have experience in public libraries, libraries is a social safety net. Oftentimes, you'll find for a lot of neurodivergent people, as we'll talk about, we end up homeless. And a lot of us end up in public libraries because of that, as kind of like a safe third space, as was mentioned earlier. And finally, also, again, myself as a neurodivergent librarian, libraries as places of work, specifically. But what's also the broader relationship between neurodivergence and labor? I'd recommend you check out this book by Robert Chapman, Empire of Normality. It really kind of unpacks some of the historical relationships between neurodiversity and capitalism. Because disability in general, as it's been conceptualized in kind of a settler colonial Western context, has always existed pretty much in relationship to labor practices, labor exploitation, how human life is valued in direct relationship to labor, or what kind of labor value can be extracted from individuals, right? Before asylums, generally family units, worked with neurodivergent family members. A lot of the times, a lot of the forms of neurodivergence, which are considered disabilities today, were not disabilities, but were potentially less impairing in historical kinds of trades and professions. So much more of the work that we do depends upon performing a certain degree of kind of neuronormative kind of emotional labor. Why, yes, I'm happy to be exploited for wages. Thank you very much. Please come again today, sir. That sort of thing. Also in relationship to the asylum kind of movement between roughly the 1600s to 1800s, this was known as the period during the trade in lunacy, which again, I have an extensive bibliography if you'd like to follow up on some of these things. That was a period in which you had a lot of private asylums opening up with varying degrees of kind of like medical interests. Also, oftentimes people were sent to asylums when family members wanted to get their inheritance. There was a lot of politics and money tied in with the treatment of neurodivergent people during this time period. Also, you might have heard about Bedlam in England, for example. Not only was it involved in this kind of trade in lunacy, but also it was perhaps most famous or infamous for being one of the places where it had kind of a sort of medical tourism, where you could go in and gawk at the crazy people and pay the asylum owners for that. So there's a lot of different ways historically that resources have been extracted from us as neurodivergent people. Then the period which I'll talk more about today, moral treatment, which oftentimes very much the moral treatment wasn't just like we should treat people better, though it was considered a progressive movement at the time, but it was also that we have to control the morals of neurodivergent people. We have, work is intrinsically ennobling, and we need to make sure that they'll only get better if we make them work, either work intellectually or work in the fields, as we'll talk about. The next stage was deinstitutionalization and the streets, which is roughly 1970s to present, right? And this is where unemployed and homelessness becomes what's known by some mad studies circles as the modern asylum, right? To use to justify authoritarian policies and budgets, means testing and system cycling, and also prisons. A lot of times throughout all of these histories, neurodivergent people have been overrepresented in prison populations, which if you've explored any of the statistics around this is still very much the case. And in the Canadian context, I think a little bit less so in the American context, sadly, we have the growing concern around MAID, or medical assistance in dying, which at least in Canada is scheduled circa 2027 to you'll be eligible if you're just neurodivergent. That'll be considered grounds to seek medical assistance in dying. Which is concerning, is a kind of neoliberal eugenics where they say you have every option is on the table, but really you've been funneled into one option because there's no other social supports for you. In other ways, right, neurodivergence labor, work causes acquired neurodivergence through workplace injuries, right? Because neurodiversity and neurodivergence, they're big tent terms. You can be born neurodivergent, you can also acquire it. But then again, also unemployment and constant precarious job seeking can also cause acquired neurodivergence and psychological injury, right? Importantly, I want to keep in mind that traumatized people are definitionally neurodivergent people, and so much of our lives for the past 5, 10, years or more have been characterized by trauma. And that's really something this is why I find it valuable to use Dr. Devon Price's formulation of not neurotypical as being kind of the baseline, but neuronormative, stressing that it's not just even about averages, it's about the ways in which we are expected to perform norm and within a very narrow range of what it means to be a body-mind in the world. So moral treatment, I've talked about this a little bit. Moral treatment was kind of like a medical modality or a therapeutic practice that kind of came just after the period of the kind of like big asylum models, right? You go from the asylum to the mental hospital to the kind of modern day centers and treatment centers. The language changes, but some of the practices don't always. At the time period between, the end of the 19th, early 20th centuries, it was considered to be a very progressive practice, right? It involved daily routines of structured therapies, work and leisure activities, like reading, which we'll talk about. But also in the case of the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital, for example, a great deal of physical activities, sporting events. Several of the superintendents were really into cricket, for example. At the same time, though, these daily routines also like discouraged idleness, that idleness itself was considered to be, in a moralistic terms, as kind of vice that was deleterious to the health of patients. But was also used to justify other kind of structured activities like putting people to work in the fields to, in this case, in this picture, grow and harvest potatoes, right? Again, as I mentioned before, many asylums maintained on-site libraries as part of patients' therapeutic treatment, which we'll talk about, and again, separate libraries for the staff. Now, this is just an example, this annual report to the Provincial Board of Health of Ontario. If you were to just quickly look at this, I don't know if you'd necessarily get that this is an annual report for a mental hospital, right? Like, look at there, like nature of employment, of the day's work performed by patients during the year ending, carpenter shop, tailor shop, shoe shop, engineer shop, blacksmith, masonry, all of that, right? Days worked, or a lot of these annual reports during this period were all about like just how many pigs and corns and how much chicken and carrots and cucumbers they were able to produce that year to sell for the kind of the maintenance of the hospital itself. And this is not unique to the context in Canada. This was part of the moral treatment approach, right? This happened in America. This happened in the United Kingdom as kind of a basic medical modality. Oh, they're psychologically unwell, make them work in the fields. This was quite common. Now, I think this is kind of an interesting point, though, to highlight that in this kind of treatment modality, it was often considered a distinction between who's working in the fields, those people who are considered to be incurable, as opposed to the curable who are considered to be more benefiting of literacy of books, right? This particular example of an article from oops, sorry, I didn't mean to make that jump, from 1847, right, in which the anonymous author says, "It is true that in many institutions for the insane, a vast amount of labor is performed by patients, acknowledging that they were put to work in a lot of cases. But the principal part of this is done by those who belong to the incurable class, and to these who constitute the majority in most establishments, manual labor is highly useful and sometimes necessary for the preservation of health and of what mind is still possessed. But the curable class are more benefited by regular and rational employment of the mind, by pursuits that engage the attention and tend to enlarge and improvement of mental and moral powers. For this purpose, asylums should be well supplied with books, maps, and apparatus illustrative of different sciences, and also collections of natural history." So you already see that there's kind of class distinctions and kind of ability distinctions made during this period when it comes to what kind of access to literature, books, materials, different patients have within these institutions. Oop, come on. At the same time, it wasn't just, purely seen as, putting them to work, right? A famous American kind of like asylum superintendent, John M. Galt, who was known for the ways in which he particularly amongst American superintendents at that time period stressed the importance of reading for psychological well-being, actually specified it as almost as in of itself a very specific form of medical modality that had to be connected with this, what we would perhaps today call the special interest of patients in asylums, right? In the library of every asylum, some few works are requisite, it being understood that when a patient is received as to whose peculiar pursuit or department of study there are no books in the library of such an institution, as great care should be exercised in the procurement of such as we would employ in purchasing an additional medicament to meet some rare physiological symptom. Right? This is reading taken very seriously as like a substantial medical modality that importantly has to be reflective of the patient's own interests or passions or practices. Which is not always the case within this kind of asylum library movement in the 19th century. Boop. But again, as mentioned, and this even leads into the kind of modern, when you see kind of these just asylum libraries become kind of modern bibliotherapy practices, where there's still kind of a distinction between the patient's libraries and the medical staff's libraries, right? In this one article from a little bit later in the 1940s, mental hygiene and psychiatric literature dealing directly with conflicts and problems of the mentally ill, if permitted to the patient at all, should be prescribed by the patient's physician inasmuch as the danger of arousing anxiety in the patient is great. So one thing to keep in mind when engaging with neurodivergent populations is that we have historically often been infantilized. This is not unique to us. Many marginalized groups experience infantilization. In this context, it is, oh, it'll just cause them anxiety. If they learn about the ways in which we as a medical practitioners are actually talking about them or talking about their concerns, right? And I think it's always healthy to be a little bit suspicious, I'll say, whenever anyone uses, well, it's just, we don't want to cause them distress. We didn't want to bother them, right? Because oftentimes what that hides is we don't want these people to be empowered or to understand what we're saying about them behind their backs. Oftentimes, historically, that's what that means. But what's deinstitutionalization? So deinstitutionalization kind of comes after this moral treatment kind of movement in a big way, right? For example, the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital, it was built in 1890. So that was kind of during like the early beginnings of the moral treatment movement, and it closed like kind of right in the middle of the period of deinstitutionalization in 1979. Again, doop-a-doop-a-doop. Oh yeah, so sorry, getting a little bit ahead of myself. Here's another picture. This is specifically from the Lakeshore Grounds Psychiatric Hospital, the site that I worked at. I don't know why they often have pictures of patients gathering potatoes in particular. One of the striking things about this one is that during the 1930s, it was debated whether or not patients should even be allowed to use labor-saving machines like the one shown here to harvest potatoes, because it was considered that the kind of harder labor of doing it by hand was part of the treatment or part of the medical modality, that harder work was considered to be necessary than even was necessary, given the machines they had at hand. And I think that's something to reflect on when we think about the nature of kind of modern labor practices and its relationship to neurodivergence. Now, the moral treatment was, as I mentioned, considered to be progressive, but it also included kind of novel treatments, what were called somatic therapies, which were like things that were done to the body very dramatically. This included electroconvulsive treatments, insulin shock, where you basically put someone in a coma and then bring them out of it, and leucotomies. Not so fun fact, they didn't actually perform lobotomies in Canada during this period. They performed leucotomies, which were really only slightly different. And again, as we'll talk about, the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital was closed in 1979, importantly under the pretense of fire safety. So again, mentioned theoretical foundations for deinstitutionalization came from the 1950s to 1970s. This is where you have people like Thomas Szasz and the anti-psychiatry movement, which while sometimes is positioned as kind of like a pro-service user and like self-advocacy group, was also kind of rooted in a very deeply libertarian belief that kind of mental illness is fake and people who need mental help are just trying to get something for nothing. Szasz's own politics were much more libertarian than they were kind of liberatory, shall we say, right? And during this period, the language of improved choice got used a lot. Well, we're not really taking away kind of resources. We're just giving you more options, right? This is probably something in America you've heard a lot in relationship to different school systems, in relationship to different healthcare options. Oh, we're just giving you more choices, when oftentimes what that really means is choices are being taken away, right? They said, well, get access to community-based supports. But generally, it was the state trying to divest itself of responsibilities. A lot of the funding that was supposed to go towards community supports in this period just did not materialize, right? Institutions were closed, and correspondingly, you see this huge spike in the homeless population, right? Increase in trauma of patients, and what is called, again, system cycling in the MAD studies literature, which is basically just saying, like, if you are a homeless person on the street who's, neurodivergent, you don't really have any one place to go. You get shunted around from system to system to system that's supposed to help you, but it's just kind of designed to keep you moving until you just become someone else's problem and maybe disappear, right? It's actually like, it's not necessarily structurally a benevolent process. It's actually just another kind of asylum, another kind of way of isolating people. So this particular picture I have here is actually an unused fire escape from the old Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital building. They had a huge kind of like construction project literally just before it was closed to install a whole bunch of these fire escapes during this period. The thing is, while in 1965 it was denied accreditation for as an institution because the buildings were not considered to be up to the fire code, by the 1970s it becomes the only mental hospital with provincial hospital accreditation in Canada, right? And again, following accreditation, the hospital's fire safety was to be reviewed every 3 years. Well, why am I focusing on this? Because I want to use this as a particular case study to talk about the ways in which oftentimes as public institutions, the metrics and even kind of standards of practice do not necessarily protect us or save us from government and institutional forces that just don't want us to exist anymore, right? This is the way the story played out, though, very tragically. November 1978, a patient actually died from smoke inhalation when a pyromaniac set fire in the lounge area of Cottage E, one of the buildings on site. And then, importantly, though, the inquest found the issues weren't specifically with, the treatment modality of the place itself, but with staffing and oversight, not fire safety, right? Oftentimes, you see this pattern where institutions are systematically defunded until they break down, and then you see calls to replace them. And that's kind of how it's played out at the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital. Now, this was Pat Lawyer. These are taken from the records of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario during the time period. This is NDP member of provincial parliament for the Lakeshore Grounds. So basically, this was in Pat Lawler's riding, right, where he says, Health Minister Dennis Timbrell, who was responsible for this at the time, said the potential for fire and the fact that the place itself was a fire trap was a determining factor in its closing it as an inpatient facility. I have always taken considerable issue with, and some degree of personal umbrage at that, because I attended the initial statements the minister made to the press, and that was the issue that turned the press and all subsequent conversation awry. It was unfair. It was proven to be quite misleading by abundant testimony. This is just some example of some of the abundant testimony that was used. It was certified by the Ontario Fire Marshal. The Etobicoke, it's pronounced Etobicoke, at least by English speakers. I don't know the Anishinaabe term for it, fire department, accrediting bodies, union reports, and a separate government-issued McKinsey report. This is one thing to think about when you're trying to protect your own institutions. So the positive metrics alone won't save you. In my own kind of example, there's numerous cases now where my institution has been specifically losing library space to admin offices where our own metrics about usage are oftentimes misleadingly used to show, well, you don't need that space. We're going to take some more from you. We don't need that space. We're going to take some more from you. You know what? The library is so important to us that we really want to base our own kind of offices out of it. So we're going to take away the whole one wing of the library, and you're going to lose your lunch room, and all of the techs are going to have to go in cubicles downstairs. You know, these sorts of things rationalized based on metrics that don't really show the need for that. It's just the numbers won't save you, I guess, is one thing I want to really stress here. Now, importantly, I don't think that like things that happen to a library are necessarily as life and death as this case, but the closure of this hospital at this particular time in this particular way did result in deaths, and they knew that it was going to result in deaths. There were a number of studies that when you take people who have only ever lived in asylums, as was the case during this period, the people who'd spent basically their entire lives from the time they were children in these institutions, and you just send them out in the community, a lot of people die. And they already had research of this in 1979. This wasn't like, oh, no one could have realized it. Now, Timbrell's own response was basically just to dismiss it as well. The coroner's report didn't mention anything about the closure of the hospital involving that death, so you can't blame me. Now, one of the things about also the closing of the hospital, right, that it was resisted. The staff opposed the closing. A number of patient groups opposed the closing. And importantly, they did in the very, very early morning, move some elderly patients to a different site. All right. So the police were actually brought in and to allow a bus and 2 ambulances to carry the patients through 100 protesters by some reports I've seen. This wasn't, the space wasn't taken away quietly. But at the same time, I also want to stress that, asylums and psychiatric hospitals were profoundly ambivalent social institutions, right? When the hospital closed, there were some psychiatric survivors there, particularly because of its use of electroconvulsive therapy, who said, this is just a site of torture. It should be destroyed, just leveled, no evidence of it. But a lot of people also wanted to preserve it. It was a deeply polarizing space with a deeply polarizing legacy. Hopefully libraries have less of that. But I would also encourage us to think about the ways in which, as librarians and information professionals, the way we position ourselves vis-a-vis being just kind of like benevolent kind of, experts, serving the underserved should be troubled and should be complicated. I mean, this goes back to Fabazatara's, vocational awe, who incidentally currently actually has a GoFundMe going for some medical funds. So consider looking that up if you have the chance. And again, I think this kind of like process is tidily summarized by this kind of union report from 1980, right? It is our belief that the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital wasn't closing simply to save $4.1 million. It was also closed to let us know that the Ontario government meant business, that it was fully committed to deinstitutionalization, and that no matter what the professional community said, no matter what the surrounding community said, no matter what the cost in human terms, deinstitutionalization in Ontario was a reality, right? This kind of encapsulates for me that sense of like the reasons that upper administration and government institutions give us for why things are generally post hoc rationalizations for decisions that have already been made behind closed doors. This is very often the case in labor history. Public discussion, transparency hasn't always been a thing. In fact, is seldom a thing. It's a pleasant surprise when it happens. And this is where I want to actually talk about the concept of gaslighting as an administrative norm, is actually in some ways a norm of governance. And also as a form of governance that has a lot of relationship to neurodiversity, because it in of itself is in some ways a very specific form of psychological harm, right? Now, the term itself comes from a 1938 play by Patrick Hamilton, in which a husband wanting to get rid of his wife basically tries to convince her that she's insane, doing things that the term gaslighting actually comes from, like changing the light level in the gas lights. And when she kind of commented on it, him just being like, what? I don't notice the difference. What are you talking about? The ways in which you can try to undermine another person's sense of reality, a sense of kind of like ability to bear witness to their own experiences, in a way of producing what is sometimes described as epistemic injustice, right? In which people aren't considered to be valid witnesses to their own experience, which again gets applied to a lot of different groups, marginalized groups, but often particularly specifically neurodivergent groups, right? Like, oh, you're crazy. It doesn't matter what you say. Like, you've all probably sadly heard that before, right? As a term of abuse, right? I won't read off this entire Britannica Encyclopedia article because it's a bit gauche, but I do think it's a kind of a helpful checklist to look at the ways in which, honestly, a lot of governmental and administrative discourse relates to kind of workers in general, right? Forcefully insisting on things which seem to be obviously false, marshalling superficial evidence, flatly denying that one has said or done something that one has obviously said or done, dismissing victims' contrary perceptions or feelings as invalid or pathological, questioning the knowledge and impugning the motives of persons who contradict the viewpoint of the gaslighter, isolating the victims, manipulating the physical environment. These are all things we see governments and administrators do to institutions that they want to destroy, while saying that, they're really concerned about fire safety, or for example. This is another reason why I kind of want to talk about the way in which the accommodations process itself is a barrier to neurodivergent participation in life in general, but also particularly like working life in libraries, right? Because administrative systems are professionally, legally, culturally, and structurally incentivized to focus on limiting liability and do the bare legal minimum, no more. Right? Everything that has made my job accessible to me is because of the freedom and privileges I have as a faculty member at Thompson Rivers University. When my colleagues who are library techs have had some similar issues, they have had to fight tooth and claw through the accommodations process, where people who have generally kind of like more complicated situations to navigate are made to jump through even more hoops. One example that's not specifically neurodivergent related, but oh, you have like kind of like breathing issues. Well, what parts per million can you kind of accommodate? Or like let's see a doctor's note for that. Just creating more and more barriers. This is why I say accommodations processes themselves are actually barriers to accessibility and to the well-being of disabled people of any stripes, but also particularly in this case, neurodivergent people, right? I would say that administrative systems take the place of medical and cultural systems to adjudicate whether or not we are, quote, the worthy disabled or simply fakers. That's really what these systems are put in place to try to prevent. They're not about providing accommodations. They're about controlling access to accommodations in a kind of dragon's hoard sort of way, right? Why should an administrator be the one to make medical decisions about what's best for you? On the surface of it, it's kind of absurd, and yet it is the norm in most parts of the world right now, right? Also, it's very important because not all of us can have diagnoses. There's a politics to diagnoses. There's a risk to diagnoses, right? In the country I'm in, Canada, as recently as 2018, you couldn't immigrate to Canada if you had it on the record that you were autistic. During the start of the pandemic in England, where I'm also sadly a citizen, they were putting autistic people on involuntary do not resuscitate lists during the start of COVID-19, right? It can affect like your custody of your children, or, you're considered to be competent over controlling your own funds and resources, right? You can lose jobs over it. There's lots of reasons why a person would totally reasonably be like, yes, I am autistic, and no, I'm not going to seek a diagnosis. Because in some ways that can and historically has put a target on your back. So by creating the diagnosis as kind of an obligatory passage point to accommodations, you're basically forcing some of the most marginalized disabled folks to, just go without, basically, or take a lot of calculated risks that may or may not pay off for them in the end. And now I'm not saying every administrator is a Nazi. I know this is a little bit provocative, but I do want to say that there's historical precedents for some of this, the ways in which kind of like our worth is valued in relationship to our labor. I want to give you with one example of a kind of an anecdote. I was at a new workplace and I was speaking to one of the upper admin, and they were kind of showing me around, like just the offices, introducing me to people, so on and so forth. We're going down the hallway and we walk by this one person, a tech, and, they say hello and they don't really respond. They just kind of just nod and kind of walk by. And when that person kind of goes out of earshot, the upper admin kind of turns to me and says, "Oh, don't mind them. That's so-and-so. And get really quiet. They're a little bit on the spectrum." Really hard worker though, right? And they didn't know about me and like where I was. And that didn't put my mind at ease at all, because what that tells me is basically, deviation from the norm will be tolerated in as much as it is exploitable. And this relationship between how neuronormative society values our worth in relationship to our productivity has a really long and troubled and sordid history, right? This goes back to Hans Asperger, the Austrian kind of doctor, and Action T4, or the kind of like Nazi kind of plan to kill disabled people in an act of eugenics, right? For those of you who don't know, one of the reasons why Asperger's has kind of fallen out of favor and fallen out of diagnostic use is increasing evidence of the ways in which Asperger wasn't just, trying to save what kids he could, but very much bought into the Nazi kind of plan. He just thought, no. Some of these autistic kids, their lives don't matter, but there's some autistic people who the Reich can use. We can still use them. And importantly, we can use their minds, not necessarily their bodies. We can use their minds. And I think that harkens back in some ways, not to the kind of the divide we saw earlier in who got more ready access to asylum librarians and who are libraries and who didn't during the period of moral treatment. And again, I have a lot of concerns about the expansion of Made in Canada, but I won't get into too many details there. But I think that this is unfortunately a permutation of this tradition. This is, again, what I call the Rudolph effect. Deviation from the normal will be punished unless it is exploitable. It's one of the reasons why, you'll see a lot of these discussions about, like embracing neurodiversity in the workplace is improving innovation. Neurodivergent people are hard workers and they have superpowers. Autistic people, ADHD people, they hyper-focus and all these sorts of things. And I know sometimes it's meant well by a lot of folks, but it still feeds into a very sinister neoliberal tradition of, again, just valuing us based on our productivity. Myself, as a neurodivergent worker, I find that there are periods where I am, yes, incredibly productive. And there are also periods where I'm a potato. There's not a lot I can do. Like, I don't have a consistent pattern of efficacy in my job roles, in my workplace. I hopefully think that it kind of like evens out in a way that at least won't get me into trouble. But like, I don't know that for sure. It's also one of the reasons why this kind of framing of like autism and neurodiversity is kind of like, it's going to improve innovation. Maybe you're not entirely wrong, but the framing of it kind of is a little bit dehumanizing at its core. It's also one of the reasons why I think a lot of the kind of like paid neurodiversity consultant models and won't necessarily kind of make the cultural change that we need to have. I think it's very great that, a single individual neurodivergent person can make a living that way. But you're kind of, in order to be in those spaces of that kind of diversity consultant kind of like environment, you already have to speak a very specific language that doesn't actually liberate us, but just kind of like gives admin a new language to kind of talk around and manipulate. And you see this kind of gaslighting, this critique, and this sense of that like labor itself is intrinsically kind of ennobling. across the Anglo-American world, really, that disabled people are historically demonized, and we're specifically demonized in relationship to the degree to which we can produce labor value, right? Again, Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK right now, has been using some deeply eugenic and messed up language to talk about disabled people as just moochers. Oh, they're all just trying to get something for nothing, right? And this language it goes back to Nazi eugenics, right? The way in which the Nazis talked about life unworthy of life and making these huge billboards and prints of like, oh, how much does the average disabled person cost you, the German, average German citizen? I think it's a deeply corrosive pattern of thought, and it is one that directly ties neurodivergence to labor and our exploitability. This is why I think it's also really important to think of the roles of cognitive marginalization and, again, I mentioned before, epistemic injustices, right? Because when you talk about kind of disability, when you think about really any domain of human life, particularly when it comes to marginalized people, the notion of expertise is polyvocal. It's complicated, right? Historically, for example, there's a reason why a lot of indigenous people neither trust nor like anthropology and anthropologists as a profession, right? Because for so long, that specific discipline was a bunch of white folks saying they were experts on them indigenous people and knowing them better and being the ones who get like job opportunities and speaking tours and all those sorts of things, right? But it's not just in the case of indigenous people, right? In the case of a lot of disabled people who also have deeply medicalized identities, or in some ways our whole experience before kind of the neurodiversity movement and activism has been characterized by other people claiming to be experts on our experiences. And this is changing, right? There's a huge body of literature now on the role of autistic adults as critical autism experts. And a lot of really good work has been done in this area, right? There's a classic kind of disability kind of like mantra of nothing about us without us. And that we do kind of constitute a different kind of cultural form, on par with if you'd have a cultural consultant, for Mi'kmaq, Anishinaabe, Secwepemc kind of people, if you're going to be working with those groups, you should also have cultural consultants involved when you're doing anything involving disability. And one, I think, really good example of this is this article by Christina Marie Wright in the Washington Library Association from 2023. She writes the title, Honey, What if the Baby is Autistic? The Importance of Neurodiversity Libraries. And she kind of gives a bit of an anecdote about her own experience as someone who's, like pregnant in the 90s and was very concerned. She'd go to the public library and like read all the parenting books. She wanted to be a good mother, all the kind of things that could go wrong, all of the things she needed to keep in mind. And that's where she learned in her public library about, this autism thing. And like that, the 90s were a period of particular, like fear of autism, right? It's like, oh God, what if the baby is autistic? What if I've done something wrong and made the baby autistic? These sorts of things. It was very common to find books like that in public library. I mean, still in some places, but particularly in the 90s, mostly if you were to find books on autism in your public library, you'd find books that kind of had that messaging, which she talks about. Now, later on in life, her children were identified as autistic, and then she actually started learning about it more and exploring not the public library system, but these very specific neurodiversity libraries, basically libraries that were set up by neurodivergent people. And that kind of like own voice positionality that didn't just treat us as a system of pathologies and failings that needed to be corrected, but as people with lived experiences, culture, very different ways of describing our failings as, just differences in how we're on the world. And it's that kind of positionality that allowed her to understand herself as also autistic. I mean, because in many cases, a lot of these forms of like developmental, neurodivergence are themselves deeply hereditary in nature. Right? And this is also why it kind of troubles me when I look at the various ways in which the labor stats, I think labor is intrinsically exploitative in many ways, but at the same time, you need it to live in our society. And the employment stats for a lot of neurodivergent people, a lot of stuff for non-autistic people right now are pretty abysmal. Honestly, a lot of us are unemployed. I'm incredibly privileged to be in the position that I'm in, but it's not always been that way, Shortly after library school, I had to leave Toronto or risk being homeless because of that manic episode that I had at the end of my last semester. And that was a pretty rough time. There's a lot of neurodivergent people that or maybe don't know are neurodivergent who have similar kind of stories of just how hard it is. Now, and this also asks us to kind of consider the ways that, well, why not, right? Is it just because, the kind of the reactionary account as well, just like, why would you want a worker who by definition can't work as much as the other people? I'm just not even going to justify that. I think that's a garbage way of thinking. But at the same time, what's keeping us out? In many cases, the job interview process itself keeps us out of employment. And I think it's worthy to kind of explore this. This particular work by Buck de Vries, I believe it's Dutch, a Dutch name, actually unpacks some of the ways in which job interviews are actually bad across the board for assessing how well a person will be in a certain workspace, right? But it is particularly disadvantageous to autistic individuals who, perform very differently in a social context, right? This other work has been done, that like it can take a matter of seconds for an allistic or non-autistic person to assess that there's something different about an autistic person and that they don't like it. That's actually just like based on first impressions, a lot of us have an uphill battle to fight, right? There's a reason why I myself really work very hard to come across as kind of maybe a bit nerdy and affable, but also very agreeable. It is a survival strategy because mostly I was called a robot in high school. Also importantly, where we talk about gaslighting, kind of post hoc rationalizations, libraries and labor, is that it's just tangibly materially true that the library isn't always a safe space for neurodivergent people. To this day, this is work done just as recently as 2023 here in Canada, right? About an autistic employees in Canada academic libraries, barriers, opportunity, and ways forwards, where one speaker says, "I'm not formally diagnosed, and I'm afraid of being let go, quote, for other reasons, if I divulge or seek a diagnosis, and divulge that. This has happened to people I know when they've mentioned diagnoses. Suddenly, they're being over-scrutinized, and reasons are found to dismiss them." Now, this is where I think also the concept of gaslighting comes in, right? Because when so many of us are precariously employed on contracts, they can always find reasons to get rid of you. It's a very commonly known practice in a lot of labor circles where if you don't want to like give someone kind of leave benefits from like firing them because you have certain responsibilities, you just make their life awful enough at work that they leave themselves so you don't have the same kind of requirements to give them pay. Right? This is a known and talked about strategy in management literature, which is basically just gaslighting someone until they quit. I don't know where else to go with that, but it's really awful that that's just kind of standard practice in some places. And even when it's not so explicitly and intentionally done, I think it's quite telling that a lot of the people I went to library school with who aren't white have specifically not had their contracts renewed because, quote, just culture, like not a good fit for the workplace culture. Like, what does that mean? Why do you only say that to your black employees? This is a pattern that I have noticed, and a number of my colleagues have commented on. That basically this disingenuous kind of post hoc rationalization does also psychological harm to individuals, right? So this is where I talk a little bit more about kind of like labor organizing and neurodivergence. If you're not familiar with the work of Dr. Devon Price, I think he's a pretty important kind of figure in these discussions. He has a lot of books out now on the topic of unmasking autism. And I have audiobook versions of them and everything. And he, even though he kind of partially made a living kind of doing that thing I talked about in terms of like neurodiversity and like diversity consultant, he also wasn't always well received in those spaces, right? This particular quotation where, he says, well, organizational leaders like want to fill the talk with tips that are useful only to individuals, a long list of which disability terms are offensive and tips for what autistic employees should do themselves to better manage their workload. Some of these conversations are worth having, he says, yet I can't help but notice that managers' eyes glaze over when I discuss changes the company must make, such as beginning to cover autism assessments on their health insurance, only to see them liven back up again the moment someone asks if the phrase on the spectrum is okay to use. In one instance, when I began describing how the use of employee surveillance software, such as keyloggers and screen trackers, harms autistic employees, a tense HR professional cut my talk off early, and then disappeared all the employee complaints about the use of such programs from the meeting's chat box. Discussing the systematic ways in which certain classes of employees were harmed became impossible. All the company wanted to hear was platitudes about how proud autistic people were to be working there. And I think this is very transferable to libraries. In my own example of a workplace I had, there was this like Not Myself Today program that upper admin wanted us to do, which was ostensibly about mental health, but meant like opening up about psychological issues to upper admin in ways that just were profoundly uncomfortable, under the guise of wellness, trying to create this situation of forced intimacy, which wasn't great. It was a bad time. And I looked up and noticed that, like, well, they say this is evidence-based. So I actually tracked down the company that put it out and I contacted them and I tried to, well, you say this is evidence-based. I'm curious, I'm an information professional. What is the evidence? Well, we can't give you that. The evidence is confidential for privacy concerns. We can give you this pamphlet about how much employers love us, though. And this is a thing you'll see a lot in discussions, not just about neurodiversity, mental health, whatnot. Evidence-based is a term, it's an important concept to have, but as a term, it's kind of been evacuated of a lot of its meaning. So many different groups use it that you have to dig deeper. Whenever anyone tells you, oh, it's evidence-based, you have to unpack that black box because it can mean so many different things. And some of them aren't genuine. Finally, specifically, again, in Unmasking for Life, Dr. Price talks about the very kind of like, I talked about metrics before, but like there are demonstrable ways in which being connected to labor movements materially benefits disabled people, right? He cites this IZA Institute of Labor Economics research that found that disabled workers at unionized companies were less likely to be fired and experienced a 29.8% wage premium compared to disabled workers at companies without unions. And that importantly, this organizing has to be done outside of the kind of purview of your employer, for example, through such things as employee resource groups, because the evidence doesn't add up for them. If it's entirely controlled and supervised and happening in the workplace, you're not necessarily going to be able to do the kind of organizing that really makes self-advocacy, makes labor power possible. But importantly, I would like to add a caveat to this, that historically, this is tangibly, manifestly true. It's better to have a labor union and strong labor practices than not. But also historically, labor unions haven't always been good about supporting disabled people or otherwise marginalized people. So this is where I'd say labor unions are necessary, but not sufficient. Because again, nothing about us without us. You need spaces where neurodivergent people can organize themselves. You need spaces where we can advocate for ourselves in labor contexts. And not just for neurodivergent people. I think this applies to any marginalized group because you have different conversations and you are aware of different struggles in a much more visceral way than would be a conventional trade union kind of organization. And I see this oftentimes actually in ways in which CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees Workers, actually has a kind of weird relationship to the library techs, my own institution, where like recently they argued against a wage increase for our techs because it wasn't recognized as being like particularly difficult work because the metrics they use to determine the nature of the difficulty of jobs is based on a very kind of trade union model that prioritizes manual labor over kind of like the information labor that techs do on a daily basis. So again, labor union, labor organizing necessary, but there's a lot more we need to do within that paradigm to make it more equitable and just. Finally, just to kind of summarize and wrap up, libraries have a long and complicated history with labor and neurodivergence, both libraries within asylums and within the mental health profession, but also libraries themselves as sites of labor and work. Often the justification for the presence of libraries has been around getting neurodivergent people back into the workforce against in public libraries. You'll often see people say, well, we need to protect our public libraries because it gets homeless people working, which on the individual basis, it's important that hopefully does improve someone's life. But as a rationale, I think it's helpful to kind of unpack, well, what does that mean? Why are we prioritizing this as a society? Regardless of the systematic barriers we face, it doesn't necessarily help neurodivergent people, remove those barriers. Also, importantly, the letter of the law is not protection enough for marginalized folks, and labor protections and power are neurodivergent protections and power, but importantly, nothing about us without us. And that's my talk. Thank you kindly for your time and your attention. Here, I'm just going to, for the sake of the recording, kind of slowly go through my citations. Boop, 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 boop. And I think that's the last one. Yes. And yeah, I look forward. We have about 4 minutes for questions, I believe.
Wonderful, Ben. As you can see, you're getting a loud round of applause, Zoom applause.
Thank you so much.
And definitely, we have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has a specific question for Ben. And Ben, I just wanted to echo some of the comments that were made as far as, we appreciate you sharing your vulnerability and the courage that you have in continuing to speak out. As a person of color myself, definitely, I don't always act the way people expect me to act. And on the flip side, people that expect me to act a certain way is not exactly how I operate, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, resonated deeply.
Mhm. Okay. Oh. Marvi Ma, what college did you go to, and how was your experience getting disability services or accommodations in university? Specifically for my library school, I went to the University of Toronto. They have an iSchool there. Honestly, the professors that made me be able to survive my manic episode at the end or at the start of 2019 did not require me to go through the accommodations process. The one professor who required me to go through the accommodations process made my life incredibly difficult. I don't know how many of you have experiences having manic episodes. It is an altered state of consciousness. Your attention is very hard to wrangle. The only reason I was able to survive that experience was because I'd basically been in school forever at that point. I had a master's before that. I had a PhD before that. I was a professor before that. That was the only way I could actually navigate that one individual professor who required accommodations. Otherwise, I don't know if I'd be able to do it. Would you like a copy of my bibliography? Certainly, I can just put it in a document. I think the video will also be shared. Oh, and yes, we'll post here and can send out slides, says Anthony.
Yeah, if that's okay with you, Ben. We'd love to share the recording and your slide deck. It's ready.
Sounds good. I'll send you the more recent one.
Wonderful. Well, we can continue having conversations with Ben throughout because he's been generous to join us for the next hour. We've had some budget cuts here at the school, and so the overall size of our talk was diminished a little bit, but I especially thank Ben and Christine for joining us today. Let me introduce Christine, and then we have some questions that we are going to discuss amongst you. So Christine is an independent scholar and guest faculty member at the University of Washington Information School. Previously, they were an academic librarian with a focus on information literacy instruction, inclusive pedagogies, and transparent teaching. Christine's current research is grounded in critical disability studies to examine the workplace experiences of neurodivergent library workers with the goal of making libraries and society more inclusive of neurodivergent people like themselves. They received their MLS from the University of Iowa, studied instructional design at the University of Wisconsin-Stout, that's where my PhD is in, completed a graduate certificate in disability studies at the University of Washington, and earned her PhD from the University of Washington's Information School. They are a dedicated educator and researcher. Christine prioritizes their neurodivergent joy through pursuits such as music composing and production, knitting and sewing, playing video games, and spending quality time with their rescue kitties. Please join me in welcoming Christine. Dr. Moeller.
Greetings, everyone. Honored to be here today.
Thank you, Christine. Okay, so these questions are for both of you, so feel free to chime in however you would like. The first question is, when we invoke moral treatment, the concept of moral treatment, what narratives or myths about disability do we risk reproducing in library history? And what's one concrete counter practice libraries can adopt today?
I've spent a lot of time talking so far. Christine, would you like to start? Or
I was going to say, actually, since this builds on your talk, I'm going to let you go ahead.
Okay, fair. Okay, so I should also stress, I'm playing with the meaning of moral treatment, I guess, in that talk, because moral treatment was a specific concept and medical modality. So that was a practice with certain theories, politics, whatnot, in the 19th and 20th centuries. But I think what you mean is also moral treatment in treating people morally and ethically. So I'm going to unpack that. But I think there's helpful distinctions. I think I've already mentioned in my talk how, you don't want to be patronizing. In fact, there's a lot of more contemporary autism research is based on kind of a researcher participant, community participant format, right? In which, when you're performing kind of research with a group, not on a group, also you need to articulate, well, how is this going to help that group, right? A lot of neurodivergent people, particularly autistic people in the literature, talk about like, so much of autism research is about finding genetic causes to helpfully eugenic us out of the gene pool rather than finding research in ways to actually help us live better, for example, because you're not actively involving neurodivergent, autistic, or disabled people within the research setup. What kind of questions are you even asking? Are those misguided questions? In a library context, I think would be very valuable then, when you say you're designing kind of like library services or programs, for disabled people, you really need to be designing them with disabled people, with neurodivergent people, right? That's how you don't avoid, like partnering with Autism Speaks or something, where if you ask almost any autistic person, we consider that to be a hate group, because it has a long history of doing hate group things, basically. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Also, I think in terms of moral treatment, both in terms of patrons and library workers, you can't adequately represent the interests of disabled people if you don't have disabled people working with you and alongside you as staff and faculty, basically. And that goes again for any marginalized group. This is one reason why representation is so important in a kind of like employment sense, right? Who isn't in the room? Librarianship as a profession has been lamenting since at least the 80s that, oh, we just have a leaky pipeline. There's so few people of color in our profession. We're like, at this point, you kind of got to accept that it's a failure of will, not a failure of capacity.
Yeah, and now related to that, I will also add that there are, like my research on the experiences of neurodivergent librarians, for example, like one of the things I discovered is that there are a lot of us working in libraries, working in LIS, right?
Mhm.
And so it's not only that you have to recognize that you have disabled neurodivergent library workers already here doing the work in this profession. But you also have to create a culture within this environment where we can be forthcoming about that identity and feel like we won't be punished for that. That there won't be some kind of stigma or outright discrimination against us for revealing that part of our identity. And I think to me that's such an important part of bringing of bringing really of creating that kind of space where the disabled and neurodivergent library workers can participate in the design of services and programs, right? We have to be able to feel like we can bring that aspect of our identity to this work. And I know for a lot of us, like that's not always the case.
It's not always safe, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And also just to follow up on that, I don't know if this is the case in the States, but I know like in Canada, at least for academic libraries, we do have like a census that we do in terms of like demographics of the profession to kind of get a sense of these sorts of things. I know Enlison, which is kind of a neurodivergent library group in England, is very interested in doing an autistic kind of like census of librarians in that context.
Yeah, and we just don't have good data about that here in the US. Often those things are done through like ALA. And so, then it's going out only to membership. A lot of people, aren't members, don't want to be members, can't afford membership. And so we have really sort of poor information about who participates in this field in general in the US.
And also importantly, even though it's not necessarily safe to come out, knowing that there's a lot of us already in libraries could then help give us a certain degree of like, logistical sway, hopefully being like, hey, there's a lot of us. If you don't actually give us like basic freedoms, maybe we can make that a problem for you as a collective.
Ben, one thing that I will always remember about your talk is nothing about us without us. Needs to be a t-shirt.
Yeah, I'm sure it is actually because it's not original. It's not. I should stress it's not original to me. It actually, I think it was a disabled group in like South Africa in the 80s. Like it has a very rich and actually intersectional history. I cannot claim ownership of that term. It's much bigger than me.
Yeah, I say that because I do think that in some ways maybe I need to reach out to both of you to have a discussion with our leadership in terms of the importance of funding, design, right? To have that perspective, because of course that slogan, that saying is at the core of user-centered design. It's not testing. We want to actually design it so that the issues are addressed from the very beginning. So so maybe I'll call on you about that, because it sometimes could be seen as extraneous costs when, of course, we're talking about building it in to our day to day, right? So.
Yeah, no, and I think you're quite right. Like, oh, it's a budget crunch time. I mean, Canada isn't quite going through what the US is right now, but we still have our own higher ed collapsing kind of experiences. And oftentimes, the first things to get jettisoned are the things that, oh, well, that just affects a small proportion of our user base. But if you say that about enough things, you're excluding a huge portion of your user base also, just from like that perspective. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes, I think we may do that. We'll have to figure out how best to do that, but it might be good for that conversation to be had. Okay, well, again, I appreciate all the comments in the chat. Feel free to ask additional questions and be part of this conversation. So let's turn over to Christine. Christine, from your faculty scholar perspective, what are 2 courses or practica design moves that meaningfully support neurodivergent students preparing for library work?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So one thing I would highlight is the need for transparency. I'm always an advocate for transparency in teaching, but I find that it is especially helpful for those of us who are neurodivergent to understand why we're being asked to do something, what the purpose is, how we're expected to go about that, right? What the expectations are for doing that thing. And so the more ways that you can provide that kind of information, I think it's going to help everyone in your class, right? There are studies about this. I think it was originally University of Nevada, I think, started doing research on transparency in teaching. And it demonstrates that it helps all sorts of students. The more clear that you can be about why you're asking students to do sorts of things, and what they can expect to gain from this thing that you're asking them to do, right? So anyway, it's that sort of student-centered kind of approach, right? Thinking about how this is aligning with their goals for being in this program. The other thing I would say that is something that I continue to sort of work on is trying to find that balance between providing structure and that kind of clarity that I just talked about, while also providing space for flexibility and some choice, right? In a choose your own adventure kind of way, right? And the reason I evoke that is because I think if you've ever read one of those books, right, it comes with a specific structure. There are points at which you get to make a clear decision, and then you move on and you continue to progress through the story, right? And so I think, that's the kind of balance I aim for in my courses, where I try to be very clear about, here's this thing, here's when it's due. But then I also provide like soft deadlines, like here's when you should really get this done by, but here's this hard deadline when it won't be graded after this point, or there will be some kind of penalty, right? So that I'm providing that kind of soft structure, while also recognizing like life happens, the world's a complicated place, and especially so right now. And you're all of the learners in our courses are coming to this work with different purposes, with different end goals. And so the more ways that you can provide that structure while enabling them that choice to pursue the things that are of interest to them professionally, I have found that just makes for a more rewarding and engaging experience for all of us.
Well said, Christine. Thank you so much. Okay, so next question is beyond ADA compliance, what specific elements of universal design, in your opinion, most improve experiences for neurodivergent patrons? And which do you think should be prioritized by all of us here? What are your golden nuggets?
Like I have, they all seem equally important to me. So I think I'm struggling with the prioritization part because it all feels really important to me.
Maybe you can start from a budget standpoint, Christine. How about that? If you,
yeah, I guess one of the things that I would say is like we all work in such different spaces, right? During my time as an academic librarian, I think I worked at like 4 different academic libraries. And so in each of those spaces, there were like probably different things that we would need to prioritize. I think, one thing that I encourage people to do is really to just step back and look at your space, right? Do a space evaluation. That's probably the first thing you can do, right? Is there clear communication? If you've never been to your library before, do you know where to go? If it's your first time there, do you know where to seek information? Do you know where the restrooms are? Do you know where, if it's an academic library, where to find the, I don't know, H section, right? Can you navigate that space? What's the lighting like? What's the noise like, right? Are you clearly communicating this area is noisy? If you need a quiet space, go to this space. Are things visually, like overstimulating is my word, right? But is there a lot going on visually? Is it crowded? And then, I think then once you've done that kind of analysis of your space, you can maybe identify like, oh gosh, we have good signage about noise, but we didn't think about lighting, or maybe we didn't think about how to, wayfinding in the library. And that's probably, my suggestion about how you would approach the budget question, right? Do you have accessible restrooms? Is there a quiet retreat space for your patrons and your staff, right? Library workers need those too, right? And then determine sort of what's lacking, what's missing in your space, and use that to determine your both action and budget priorities.
you're here, Ben.
Mm-hmm. Again, I think just like making sure you have a diverse collection of people you're listening to, like in terms of like, because like I don't know what a schizophrenic person needs to navigate a library space, for example. That's just not within my kind of neurodivergent experience. So also just not assuming that a one size fits all model works for neurodivergent folks, I think is important to keep in mind. Like I do think as much as, I tend to speak from an autistic ADHD positionality, that voice is overrepresented in these discussions. And I'm very aware of that. Actually, it was quite striking. I went to a big critical neurodiversity studies conference out of Durham in the UK this summer. And it was one of the first places I saw where there were a lot more people who were Tourette's, who were schizophrenic or experienced psychosis. Like it was a much actually diverse kind of audience and collection of speakers than I'd ever seen in a neurodiversity conference before, which I think was very telling. Also just, to echoing a lot of the things that Christine said, any ways that you could have to give people control over their own experiences and their own environments are going to be good. You don't really know what's best for any individual person. Hopefully they have some sense of that. So just give them that power. And that's one of the things where I think a lot of institutions kind of balk at, heaven forbid someone control the light level in a space. And that can be tricky too, though, right? Because oftentimes there is the reality of competing accommodation needs. It's a lot easier when I can set up my office in a very particular way, but when it's supposed to be a shared space, again, I think that's where it gets complicated. So like, yeah, but it can be tricky because I don't know about you all, but I find that the use of space is one of the most fraught institutional questions I've experienced in my time as a librarian. People are very jealous about who controls what space and who has what say over what space, physical space. But
Yeah,
it's not.
and how it's used, right?
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm,
Right, whether you're using it the right way or
mhm,
not, as if there were a right way.
mhm. It's like that classic kind of design thing where it's like the sidewalk and then there's the dirt path, kind of. Um, but yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Again, like I think not enough people think about wayfinding, as Christine mentions. Like, even just having pictures. Again, not even just thinking about like big budget stuff, but things that are relatively low budget but could have a proportionally large impact. Even just having like pictures or videos of like someone navigating that space, for instance, can be very helpful. I find, I'm the classic person who just curses at the Instagram or Facebook page of restaurants I haven't been to before because I'm like, I don't want to see your food. Get these pictures out of the way. I want to see what the physical space looks like.
Or just put a map on your website.
All right. Thanks, Ben and Christine. The next question goes to empowerment for the disabled community. So, partnership models. What community-led or co-created initiatives have you seen that move libraries from just not just serving to sharing power with disabled communities? If you've seen something like
I don't think libraries are very good at sharing power in my experience, to be quite frank. I don't know,
that, trick
Christine.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I wish I had a fabulous example, but unfortunately, that is not something I've come across in my work and research in libraries. Um, I think I have heard of like small library programs where people are involving, and I think, this is particularly in conversations around early childhood literacy
Mhm.
and that sort of thing, which of course doesn't at all speak to the adult experience in any way. But I have heard of programs where they are more directly involving caregivers in conversations about services and programs and collections, right? So trying to understand the perspectives of those who are directly impacted and using that information to inform how they carry
Mhm.
out those services, those programs that they're developing, what
Mhm.
they add to their collection. But I would say, in the cases that have heard of, that's often comes down to individual effort
Mhm.
rather than sort of this bigger, I think, what your question seemed to be speaking to, right, was this bigger idea of developing a really intentional partnership. And, I think I recognize time, resources, are especially difficult right now. And what I've found in my work too is that people want to do things, but they feel like all of these pressures on us in this profession are really minimizing the capacity for that sort of thing. And yet, I guess, I think the thing I think about when I hear those, yes, I understand that. And yet what are we doing if we are not working hard to understand the communities that we are claiming to serve? And the only way we can do that is not by assuming what they need, right? That's going to get us back to this sort of charity model, right? Where we're invoking this like kind of white saviorism, where we're deciding, yeah, exactly, Ben, yeah. Right. We're going to help our poor neurodivergent patrons, and you're making choices for them, right? That's not what we want to be doing. And to be informed, right, we have to be building these kinds of partnerships. We have to be seeking that input. As Ben has mentioned as well, right? It can't just be one person. There are so many different ways of being that we need to recognize and acknowledge and make space for in our libraries and in our library profession. And we can't do that on our own, I guess, is where I'm going with this.
Absolutely. And I think that like there's a lot of like understandable anxiety, but like sharing power, particularly if you're a librarian, like doesn't mean you're sharing responsibility in terms of if things go wrong or if they're complicated or if they're messy. That I think there's a lot of trepidation around that. It's one of the reasons why institutions only really tend to like structurally make changes around disability when they feel like they're legally obliged to. Because the question is like if it goes wrong, because again, a lot when you're working with neurodivergent communities, there's a lot of different people and personalities. We're not a monolith, you know. And like we're complicated. We can be messy, you know. We're not all perfect angel babies, um, and it does involve a certain degree of risk. And I think that particularly when people are feeling threatened and vulnerable, as I feel like most of us are now, that is harder to do. You know, there's a lot of like contextual reasons why people might want to like keep their head down right now, but I feel like it's an understandable response, but like for those of who can afford to do it, it's kind of a necessary one.
Thank you both. So let's talk about careers. So what hiring, mentoring, and promotion policies would most improve retention and advancement for disabled library workers?
How long do you have?
Give or take about 20 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, this is what my research is about, so I could talk about it for days. But I'm trying to like quickly distill. Again, I come back to transparency, right? I think the first step that everyone could take in this regard is really being much more clear about expectations. That means doing things like really thinking about your interview process. First of all, are you actually assessing what you think you're assessing in your interview process, right? I think this touches on what Ben was speaking to earlier during his keynote. Is the interview doing what you think it's doing?
Mhm.
Have you been clear ahead of time of what the expectations are for that interview process? Share questions in advance, right? Unless you're really testing, like, can you respond to this question quickly? Which is probably not what you're assessing in an interview, right? So allow people to have some time to think through their responses, and come with an intentional answer to those questions. Be clear, academic libraries and the interview process is brutal. It is brutal when you are disabled. I have chronic illness. I am also ADHD. I have PTSD. I have come undone during academic interview processes because they are so hard. In terms of sensory overwhelm, of physical overwhelm, of not getting any breaks, of being expected to perform in very specific ways. It's the like 12 hours of interview of being on, which is exhausting for me. Tours that were entirely too long, right? So again, there are all of these ways in which even that initial interview process is already excluding so many people from this profession. Second, when you hire people, again, have an onboarding process, a clear onboarding process that introduces people to the work expectations, to the culture of your particular organization, of where things are, of who you're supposed to contact when. These are the things I heard over and over again in the interviews that I did with neurodivergent librarians, is how poorly communicating all of these things are when you first come to a new organization, even if you're already an experienced librarian. And then I don't want to like take up the rest of the time. So I will say like the same goes for advancement, right? Be very clear about what is expected, about how you progress toward that, while also like, again, it's sort of rethinking, like, are these criteria for advancement really doing and assessing the things that you think they are? because so often they're kind of hoops to jump through that create additional barriers for neurodivergent, disabled, and library workers who are marginalized in other ways as well. And I'll stop there so that I can give Ben a moment to talk to.
Well summarized, Christine.
Reinforcing, seconding all of that. Again, also particularly like flying into a space to do an interview. I'm already like taxed through the flight, then the day-long interview process, and then oh God, they're going to watch me eat. I occupy a meat puppet awkwardly. How is this going to look? Those sorts of things. And why do you need to do that? Do you need to have the person physically in the room with you? What do you get out of that? What are you testing out of that, really, right? Also, again, questions in advance, even just today, for a lot of neurodivergent people, we have to translate these questions into our own language beforehand, because generally when interviewers ask questions, they're not asking the question they think they are. Or maybe they do know what they're asking, but they're not being upfront about it, and they're trying to secretly get in. Oh, we want this, but we're going to see how they handle that. And it's not helpful. It's not actually, a good way of doing it. I think that the way that I got my particular role was there were a number of green flags, I guess, in the way I got my job at Thompson Rivers University, which I think speaks to some of the folks specifically at the library here. I can't give too much credit to the upper admin, but where I was actually, they offered to have someone who wasn't involved in the hiring committee have a conversation with me before the interview about expectations and culture and any other questions I had, even before the interview, so I could just get a sense of what kind of place is this. And that person was very direct with me about, the good and the bad. It wasn't just yep, we're a perfect workplace. Everyone wants to work here, because that's not helpful. I think there is kind of a fear of not coming across as, libraries are dysfunctional. All workplaces are dysfunctional in my experience to varying degrees. The degree to which someone can actually be upfront with you about those ways and why they think it's still a good place to work, despite those issues, I think is very telling. And I really kind of was grateful to the folks in my department who helped facilitate that. So they did that first of all. They circulated the questions well in advance. It was during, the kind of time when people were still caring about COVID at an institutional level. So it was all remotely done, which I also found, easier to do. In my case, sometimes I have a harder time. I mean, I can be very loquacious, as you have seen, but there are certain contexts in which actually speaking is more difficult for me, particularly when I get more taxed, more fatigued. I find being able to type and write answers sometimes to be very accessible. In fact, I'm very grateful that in a lot of meetings I have, because I'm in a satellite campus and everyone else is 3.5 hours south of me, that oftentimes in work meetings, the primary way I contribute is over text. And I find that so much easier on me, honestly.
Well, both of you are incredibly articulate, so thank you for, again, sharing your wisdom. We have a few more minutes for a few more questions. So let's talk about preparative descriptions in the catalog. So what metadata or subject heading changes do you feel are most urgent to reduce kind of pathologizing language and catalogs and finding aids? And what would be a realistic rollout first steps to just get it moving in a library?
It's something I struggle with because I work with a lot of nursing students in my current role. And in my experience, medical professionals don't always take kindly to being corrected in terms of their use of language. I'm the expert here. What are you talking about? So in terms of if it's forward facing or front facing in terms of, oh, did you mean, did you mean autistic person rather than person with autism? Those sorts of things that are kind of acknowledged in the community. Sometimes, to be fair, sometimes folks respond well to that, but not always. And I think it's proportionately harder when the professions you're dealing with are seen to have more cultural power than others. I have a harder time working with doctors than I do oftentimes with nurses, for example. So the power dynamics are at play in terms of will the actual group or actually kind of accept that? If it's back end and they don't see that, well then, that's a different story. From the metadata. Yeah, go for it.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ben.
No, I was please.
Okay. I was just going to add that in addition to the power dynamics, right? There's also that sort of world view, right, where um, medical professions are very much oriented toward diagnosing a condition, addressing it, fixing it, curing it in some way, right? And so worldview also plays an important role here. Ben, I think you were talking earlier during your keynote about all the research money, right? Here in the US, there's a long history of an incredible amount of government spending going to that kind of cure-oriented research regarding ways of being like autism and ADHD, rather than focusing on making our lives, improving our lives, and so that becomes another challenge in this regard, because pathologization might not be seen as such a bad thing in that kind of worldview. And so, to me, I think, part of it is really about educating people about, trying to have those conversations, so that people become aware about why there might be resistance to certain forms of language, to certain ways of constructing someone else's identity for them. Because I think to me, that really is the first step, because that's how we build that drive then to change, right? It's sort of like organizing, right? You build your power base, and so that it's not just you saying, hey, this language, or why did you say it that way? Because, from my perspective, I prefer this kind of language construction or this terminology. There you have more of that power then, right, to push for that kind of larger scale change.
Actually, on that topic, I don't know, are folks familiar with the Homosaurus? It's actually like an LGBTQ kind of like community run metadata project for libraries. I got Autie gender in there. It's my kind of like place in the history books. I think it would be very beneficial to have something like that for disability or neurodivergence, specifically a community organized metadata standards, and to actually take those seriously. Because as we have seen, Library of Congress subject headings don't always move as quickly or in the ways that we would like them to, from like a just kind of like, yeah. And also even just like, I don't know about your institutions, but like we don't even have a cataloging librarian at my institution. So much of the metadata is just left up to the publishers and the distributors and the platform owners. And it's weird and wrong so much of the time. So even just like caring, I mean, this is the bar is in hell kind of caring, but like even caring about cataloging metadata in the first place, I feel like is an important thing to have, and it's not every institution even does that.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Christine. So let's talk about KPIs. And it's obviously everyone's in the KPIs these days, but how do you measure progress for real inclusion for patrons and staff while avoiding practices that over-survey or burden disabled people, thereby excluding their voices?
I'm sorry, I was responding to a message in the chat and did not process anything you said.
No worries. It's basically how do we measure real inclusion? So when we talk about key performance indicators, when we talk about both our staff and serving the patrons, how do we do that without over surveying or doing leveraging practices that exclude them unintentionally?
I mean, I think it's like I don't want to come across that like I hate numbers. I don't hate numbers, but I think that it is healthy to be suspicious of what metrics are doing. I don't think metrics are necessarily the best way of showing positive engagement, empowerment, collaboration with communities. And quantitative kind of evaluations can also be fudged, don't get me wrong, but I sometimes fear that our profession depends too much on science envy, I guess, to kind of make arguments about our value. And maybe that we have to when we're dealing with kind of like economist brain folks. But I do feel like it doesn't necessarily actually help us understand what we're doing. It's just trying to feed metrics into the metric eating monster that is all of our, managerial classes. Um, I think that it like in terms of more empowerment, you actually have to like have on the ground people talking to people, asking them like, how did this help you? I think people coming back is a good sign. I think people actually like doing things that you didn't expect with the resources that you've provided is a good sign. You know, even if something is maybe seeming silly as like I did some work when just like stickers, and one of the neurodivergent patrons was like, okay, like, but I don't want to just do stickers. I want to like Frankenstein these stickers. I want to cut them all up and make them all like something else. Like, I feel like that's actually really cool. And I think that can apply to a lot of different areas of library programming and organization. Where's the good Frankenstein?
Yeah, and to build on that, I think just ask people, right? Hear their stories, hear their perspectives. It doesn't necessarily have to be through a survey. Like I did a huge nationwide survey. That's not to say that I don't value surveys, but they have their time and their place, right? And right, if you're constantly surveying people, especially people who have some form of marginalized identity, at some point that starts to feel extractive.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I
extractive.
have the right word there. Yeah, right. But
Yeah.
that you're just extracting information from them. And so, I think there are two sort of sides to this then, is that you have to ask people when you have them there for a program or a service, get their input. Is this working for you? What can we do to improve this? What brought you here? What made you interested in this? Those kinds of things. And then when you do things like surveys, this is a big thing in an academic library I worked at that loved to do student surveys every year about the library and that space and services and programs for the students. And the problem was we never got to do anything about it, right? We didn't have the budget or the capacity or the people to address any of the things. And so the students who had been there for 4 years were like, oh, here they go again.
Yeah.
This stupid survey that they never do anything about. And so
Yeah.
when you are doing this kind of measurement assessment of how you're progressing, you also need to communicate what you're doing to address those needs that have been shared with you, right? You have that responsibility to the people who have been vulnerable and shared their experiences with you to say, we heard you, and here's the action items that we are doing to address the things that we've heard. And yes, we know that there are these other things and we've heard them, and here's why we can't get to them yet, but here's how we're going to work toward that, right? Because otherwise, then you get to that point where the measurement itself becomes another burden, and that doesn't feel authentic and can potentially damage your relationship then with that community in return.
Absolutely, very strongly support and agree with that. I'm kind of sick of your voice matters. Tell us, what do you think? Every from well, I guess Tim Hortons is a very Canadian reference, but like Starbucks to like to Pizza Hut do that to you, and like it's not for your benefit. And again, I have very vivid memories of doing a library space assessment survey, keeping in mind accessibility, making a whole bunch of proposals, and basically we lost all of that space to admin anyway, so nothing mattered. So yeah, follow up and transparency, communicating, even if it's just going to be delays, right? Like be honest about that. Like, hey, we thought we get this to you by the end of the semester or something. Sharing, I mean, I know it gets complicated when you're sharing data with like a sensitive nature, but even just like summarizing kind of like, this is what we've heard, yeah, I think just everything Christine said is really important.
Yeah, I think as you were both talking, I was thinking as a mixed methodologist myself that ultimately quantitative data biases the minority voice. We call that we call outliers extraneous data. And so this is really a classic example again of how important qualitative data is. The individual voice, the minority voice, they're minorities for a reason, underrepresented, right? And so if you just go with data, then by default you're biasing those that don't have as much of a voice.
Absolutely. Yeah. Who's not in the room is incredibly important in these conversations.
Yeah, for sure.
And yet,
okay, so let's go. I'm sorry, go ahead, finish.
No, go for it. Taking turns.
All right, So let's go to our lightning round as we wrap up. So in the next 90 days, name one change we could implement for the coming year, and what could we do? So in the next 90 days, what would you suggest we do to try to focus on disability justice and practice in libraries or the field of library information science?
Next 90 days, specifically at your school, or
I think for right, like individually, I think for all of us, what would be a general?
I mean, organize, join, kind of like I actually, Neuroglamours Canada has a number of American members because Americans keep on saying they don't have anything like Neuroglam in the States. Make a Neuroglam in the States, folks. Like, you need to organize, even if it's so simple as like, Neuroglam is kind of like starting small, but like, we have a Discord server, we share resources, advice, information, consoling each other when things are crappy. We have an annual conference. We're trying to work our ways up to doing some more tangible, like labor related stuff, but it takes time to build those communities, but you have to start somewhere, right? Currently we're almost 200 people on that server. Not all of them are Canadian. There's some folks from Brazil and Sweden and the States as part of that server. But I think that's the biggest thing, honestly, because I think that when you have more neurodivergent librarians organized together and self-aware, like a self-realized, neurodivergent person, that's going to translate into better advocacy for neurodivergent or otherwise disabled folks. I should stress, neurodivergence doesn't cover everyone. I think there needs to be a larger kind of disability kind of like conversation to be had, but still, within that space.
So Ben, 2 follow-up questions. 1, are you still taking Americans? And 2, what about students?
So yes, we are still accepting Americans. I know that the relations between the two countries are kind of strained right now, but I don't hold you personally accountable for that. So absolutely. I can share a join link in the chat if there's interest.
Now. I'd like to push it out to our community. So we have a very big community of alumni, current students, and faculty and staff. So.
Sorry, that was the first question. Was that you said there was a second?
Oh, well, no, you answered. You do take Americans and you do take students.
Yes. We take Americans and we take students. We have had some folks actually ask us about the complications of if they're faculty at a library school and there's students there, if the students are complaining about their profs. We haven't had that come up as an issue yet. Currently, we're accepting everyone, but like there is some we need
to hear it.
Yeah, it's a collective. It's a collective sense. I view myself as just a facilitator. I'm not in charge of things. I just try to listen to what folks are saying and make it happen to the best of my limited abilities. I think, let me know if that link doesn't work. That should be an invite link to the Neuroglam Discord. We actually just had our conference last Friday, actually about libraries and fascism, because again, it seemed topical.
Let me add this to my notes. That's great.
It worked for me, Ben.
Good stuff.
So,
Christine, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was trying to think about this from I guess from a programmatic perspective as well. Being an instructional designer, sometimes I can't help that kind of thinking. And I guess the one change, Actually, here it is. I'm going to come back to something I feel like I've probably said multiple times throughout today's conversation. So let's just go with that one. And that's just be more transparent, right? Whether that's in your work as a library professional, in your teaching, find all the ways that you can to be clearer about why you're asking people to do certain things or why you're asking them to do it a certain way. Again and again, I've heard from neurodivergent librarians how so many things there's this whole hidden curriculum in higher ed, but there's a different hidden curriculum in the field as well. And so the more ways that you can make those things that are currently hidden visible to your students, to your colleagues, to your direct reports, that's a thing that's going to help everyone, but will especially impact and improve the ability for us neurodivergent people to be successful in those situations. And then we won't have to ask you 1,000 questions, just maybe 20.
And also, I think actually on that topic, sorry, just riffing there. Not all of us, but a lot of autistic and ADHD folks do prefer text, so that they can refer back to it. I find that a lot of upper admin hesitate to do this because they don't want a paper trail, particularly when they're being not the best. But it does make things a lot easier.
Yeah, I was going to type it, but I think I can say it faster, right? Ask people about their preferred communication method.
Yes,
right?
Communication preferences.
Is it in person? Is it text? Is it email? If your organization has multiple communication channels, be clear about when you're supposed to use which one. Teams, email, Slack. We have all of those things. I'm still not clear on when I'm supposed to use which of those, to be honest, right? So a little clarity would be helpful there, as well as understanding what's going to help people feel like they can communicate effectively, right? Like Ben was saying, and I'm the same way. I'm finding my words today, but when I'm really tired and my chronic illness is flaring, that is definitely not the case. And so in those scenarios, right, writing can be a much more effective method of communication for me. And so I think also recognizing that may change and allowing that kind of flexibility is really important too.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And on behalf of the School of Information at San Jose State, my deep thanks to Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Moeller, and to everyone who contributed today through your questions and reflections. If today resonated with you, please stay in touch. We are going to post the slides and the recording. Let me put some links in for you. And I want to give special thanks to those that helped today happen. So definitely student assistants Nicole Azoff and Ananda Kearns for their behind the scenes work. Alfredo Alcantar and Claire Azola, who's with us right now, for their tech support. We always appreciate it and helping us run things smoothly. We have 2 future symposia coming up. So Hispanic Heritage Month in collaboration with Reforma, which will be in October. We haven't set a final date yet. And also the Native American Heritage Month in November in partnership with the American Indian Library Association. So again, we are honored that you joined us today. Really always am enriched through, our wonderful speakers. I think Ben and Christine, maybe, I don't know if you guys do consulting on the side, but accreditation is a big deal for LS education. So, and I know we don't have anything specifically focused in this area. So I would like to talk to you about that because
I'd be open to it.
That is one way to cause change, right? Yeah. So let's talk about that in the future because that does resonate with decision makers, right? So,
for sure. Yeah. Please reach out. I'd be happy to chat with you about that too.
Yeah, that would be great. So again, thank you for your time, your insight, your community to building inclusive, accessible library and information services and spaces. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And we'll see you at the next event. Thanks, everybody. Take
Thank you,
care. Cheers.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.